to you. I'm David Littman.
And I'm Aaron Baker. We're so happy to have you here tonight. We have reporters out in the field as well. Our Marangeli Lopez in downtown Tyler. She's covering the Republican primary for Attorney General, where East Texas Congressman Louis Gohmert is trying to move from D.C. to Austin. And then Bryce Brauneisen's in Kilgore. He's covering the campaign to replace Gohmert in the 1st Congressional District.
This night could set the tone for midterms across the country. Texas is the first primary on the calendar, so this is the first chance to see if Republicans nationwide can regain control of Congress from the Democrats.
Yeah, their new district boundaries and new voting procedures as well. So all throughout, it's a historic night in the Lone Star State.
And let's begin with a changing of the guard in Washington, D.C. With Louis Gohmert running for Attorney General, East Texas has to pick a new U.S. representative for the first time in nearly 2 decades.
And there are 4 GOP contenders for that seat. Smith County Judge Nathaniel Moran had the biggest political resume, and it looks like as of results right now, it looks like he'll be the Republican nominee for November. You can see 67% right now compared to 23% for Joe McDaniel, 6% for A.D. Atoli, and 4% for John Porro. Now, Bryce Brauneisen's been watching this race closely and joins us live in Kilgore from the Moran campaign's watch party. Bryce, what's the mood there right now?
Good evening, guys. So the atmosphere right now is just absolutely lively as the poll numbers keep rolling in. And I am joined here by congressional hopeful Judge Nathaniel Moran. Judge Moran, how's the atmosphere looking like right now? And especially with the poll numbers rolling in, what's the mood like with you and your campaign?
Well, the mood over here in Gregg County at the Country Tavern is absolutely electric. We are grateful for those that got out to vote today and grateful for the support that we're seeing in these early results. We're hopeful that it's going to continue throughout the night.
You got it. And Judge, moving forward towards November, what's the main focus going to look like for you?
Well, from here to November, we're going to continue to have a listening tour throughout Congressional District 1. We want to build as many strong relationships as possible throughout this Northeast Texas region. We want to hear from folks about what's important, what we need to take to Washington, D.C., and to make sure that we stand for liberty when we get to D.C. That's the goal. We're going to get to D.C. and we're going to spread East Texas up to Washington, D.C.
Absolutely, and as you could see, I wasn't kidding. The atmosphere in here is lively. Everyone is in great spirits. And I'm going to pass it over to you, David and Aaron. Do you have any additional questions you'd like me to ask Judge Moran?
All right, thank you very much, Bryce. Again, these are very early results. We're just starting to see some of these numbers rolling in across East Texas, but Nathaniel Moran has the experience as Smith County Judge, has a lot of name recognition going along with that. So far, 67% of the votes that have come in are heading his way.
Yeah, I think this was no surprise for the most part. At least we all pretty much expected Moran to take this, and as of results right now, it looks like he is. But the question that I have, or the interesting thing that I noticed throughout his campaign is, as a judge, it's kind of, you don't necessarily see the political side as much with a judge as you do when you're running for Congress. So the ads were a little bit different coming from the Moran campaign.
Yes, and it's the county judge, so he's not sitting in the courtroom so much deciding criminal cases. Does have that little bit of political background running the county, but it's a very different tone than what we've seen from Congressman Louis Gohmert over the years. Congressman Gohmert, very much a firebrand in Congress, willing to speak perhaps some unpopular opinions at times, willing to get attention for himself. Nathaniel Moran hasn't been that kind of person as county judge, hasn't struck that tone during the campaign. So it'll be a very different sense of what he's going to provide for East Texans in D.C.
And different for East Texans in general, because it's been, almost 20 years since they've had a choice on the Republican side, or this type of choice for District 1.
Yeah, Louis Gohmert had won 9 straight campaigns, and there hadn't been many close calls as he'd been running for re-election. Yeah. So it's just a different sense at the ballot box today, having someone to choose.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of the Republican primary for Attorney General, it might be the most hotly contested race of any race in Texas tonight. Ken Paxton looking for a 3rd term, but he has 3 high-profile challengers taking aim at his record and his reputation.
And the polls made it seem like this one would head to a runoff. The only question was who Paxton would face in that runoff. The answer? Still TBD. Again, these are very early results. Paxton has 43% of the vote. He needs to hit 50% to avoid a runoff. Right now, retired Supreme Court Justice Eva Guzman polling at 22%. Land Commissioner George P. Bush, 21%. Gohmert still within striking distance, 15% of the early votes so far.
Yeah, this is interesting, too, on several fronts. One, I was wanting to see how people voted in East Texas, and we're seeing some of the results came in. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Early voting showed that Gohmert was doing incredibly well in East Texas.
Yes.
It's just that name recognition problem, I feel like, for most of the state. You have Guzman, who was a Texas Supreme Court justice. You have George P. Bush, which obviously has the Bush name recognition.
Carries a long way.
Exactly. And then you have Kim Paxton, who's been in the office for a while. So it's just, I think it boils down to a name recognition. What do you think?
Yeah, we've seen Gohmert so far getting about 60% of the vote from Smith County thus far, showing that people out here know him. Again, they've elected him 9 times to Congress. They know him, they like him, but perhaps some of the voters in West Texas, South Texas, Houston might not know him as well, leaning on those familiar names that they do know.
Yeah, and again, get back to campaign ads, another fascinating one, because just watching the campaign ads, fellow Republicans attacking each other and going back and forth, it got hot out there leading up to the primary between Paxton and Guzman, and Paxton and Gohmert and Paxton.
Yeah, as all 3 of them were jostling for that second spot in the runoff, they knew they needed to start attacking each other to create that little bit of distance.
Yeah.
And aside from attacking Paxton, and so we've seen some interesting comments among the 3 of those contenders.
It's a good way to word it. Interesting comments. I like that. This is, like we said, one we're going to keep an eye on all night long, just because this is a particularly hotly contested race across Texas, and we'll definitely see what happens with this one. It'll be interesting to see. All right, let's turn to our Moran Lopez. It's a big night for Gohmert. He gave up his spot in Congress to get into this race.
Yes, Moran Lopez is with the Gohmert campaign tonight. They're in downtown Tyler. Moran, what's been the feeling there as the numbers have come in?
Hey guys, it's actually, very lively out here right now. We've got a lot of people here. The Gohmert campaign manager just came over, and then I'm being told that Louis Gohmert himself is still driving over from DFW, where he spent most of his day today with voters. Okay, so right now I'm going to bring in the Smith County Republican Party Chair, David Stein. He's here with me. How's it going?
Good crowd so far. Glad we got so many people that have showed up, and more come as the night goes on. But got some early results in. Mail-in ballots are finally tabulated, and so now we start counting numbers.
Yeah, that's right. And so we were taking a look at some of those numbers right now, and of course it's too early to tell. We've got about 22 of those precincts reporting. But when you were looking at them with me, what kind of shocked you the most?
A number of them are really close. Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, all did really well in Smith County, and as well as statewide. So those may not be as close as some had suspected. But statewide races, some of those are still up for grabs. Attorney General's race may be a runoff, may not be a runoff. Land Commissioner looks like that's going to be a runoff. And I've seen for Land Commissioner, I've seen our results. I haven't seen the whole statewide results yet to see where those are landing.
Yeah, and like we've mentioned, it's a little early in the night, right? So a lot could happen. And we were just mentioning Louis Gohmert. And so he right now is about 15%. Is that shocking you, or what were the results that you were looking at from Smith County?
Well, Smith County had him way ahead by a lot. And so what I don't know is those precincts that are in, where are they from? I would suspect he would carry the rural communities and not as much as the urban. And so I think some of the other candidates could gather more urban voters. And so if that's the case, they haven't gotten the rural vote in, that could account for that. But it all depends on what those precincts are that reported.
That's right. And that's something that we're for sure going to keep an eye on tonight, as well as everybody else here, all of the other races that are happening tonight.
Absolutely. There's plenty going on. I mean, we've got county commissioner races, and one of them looks really close. Another we're looking to see in precinct 2, if that's going to go into a runoff. The county court at law may be a runoff, may not be a runoff. And so there's a lot going on, and then it just depends. We're waiting on all the ballots to come from the voting locations, because a lot of folks don't realize what happens here is physically those boxes are driven by somebody to the hub downtown, so that they can then take those ballots, run those through the machines, and then get them tabulated.
Yeah, so it sounds like they've got a lot of work to do, but of course we'll be here all night, and we will give you guys the latest on what's happening with this race. I know Louis Gohmert's expected to show up a little later, so stay tuned. We will have interviews with him, and we'll tell you about what happens tonight. For now, I'm going to send things back to you guys in the studio.
All right, thanks, Mara. Let's take another look at those numbers now, where they stand so far for the Attorney General race on the Republican side.
okay?
Ken Paxton with 43% as of right now. Eva Guzman with 22%. George P. Bush close behind her with 21%. And then Louis Gohmert as of right now with 15%. So, David, we were talking about Louis Gohmert there. She's obviously at his campaign site. What do you think's next for him, assuming he doesn't win this? Because he's been in Congress for almost 20 years. I can't imagine him not wanting to be in some office in Texas on some level. So where does he go next if this doesn't work out?
That's going to be the question of the hour, and hopefully Marangeli will be able to get an answer to that, because when he mentioned initially that he might run for Attorney General, he might go back and run for Congress again, he mentioned at that point he might only want to run for one more term in Congress. So will he want to sit out for 2 years and then try to go back for another campaign, for another office? Will he try to go the TV commentator route? Maybe try to find something at the local level? There are a lot of options. He does have a lot of name recognition. It's just going to be up to Louis to decide what he wants to do.
Yeah, for sure.
So for a little bit more context, we're joined now by Katie Owens. She's a government instructor for Kilgore College. Katie, thanks so much for being here and for joining us to talk about this race.
Thank you for having me. The Republican Attorney General's race certainly is an interesting one to watch. I think with Louis Gohmert in particular, looking at Decision Desk, he is pulling ahead fairly significantly in the East Texas counties that he represents currently. But across the state, it does look like Ken Paxton is still ahead overall. But I do expect that this race will end up going to a runoff. It's just a question of who Paxton is going to be facing in that runoff election.
And given what we've seen from all four of these candidates during this race, what do you imagine that the runoff for these next 2 months would look like?
I think it's going to be a race of who can out-conservative the other one. So who can pull further to the right and bring in some of those really dedicated voters. We talk a lot with primary elections. These are the most dedicated, most partisan voters. Primary runoff elections, you get even more dedicated and more partisan voters. So that is something that we should be looking for. And that's going to be a really hotly contested race that will get a lot of media attention, likely across the state, even across the country.
Katie, do you feel like whoever wins this and goes up to compete with Ken Paxton, do you feel like those votes will consolidate as kind of the anti-Paxton vote, or do you see them kind of parceling out to different people depending on who wins tonight or who goes up against Paxton tonight?
Yes, I do think it will be a significant challenge for Paxton. Essentially, you know, he's getting about 42% of the vote right now. So the other candidates are receiving the other 60%. So I think it will be very much can you stomach voting for Paxton, or were you that deeply committed to the candidate you voted for? So I definitely think it will be a more of an anti-Paxton kind of vote.
All right, and as we've been looking at the numbers for Louis Gohmert, getting roughly 60% of the early vote in Smith County, and likely, again, high numbers elsewhere in East Texas. Is this just a regional preference as far as which of these challengers are getting the votes in the different areas?
Yes, I do think a lot of that is regional preference. We know Louis Gohmert. He is a known quantity. And although Ken Paxton is getting second place in most of these East Texas counties, we've already voted. We've elected Louis Gohmert several times now. He is a known quantity, and voters in East Texas are comfortable with that. So I think that cannot be discounted in looking at the vote returns from East Texas.
All right, Katie, thank you so much for your time tonight and for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, let's head to the top of the ticket, and that's the race for governor.
Yeah, this is the big one. Greg Abbott seeking a third term as governor of Texas, facing a primary challenge from a pair of established politicians who believe he hasn't been conservative enough.
Question was, did voters agree, or did they like the direction the state's going? And so far, it looks like the status quo will prevail.
Yeah, Governor Abbott with the big lead in the early voting. You see the check mark next to his name. 69% of the ballots so far coming in for Greg Abbott. Looks like Don Huffines and Allen West, both in the second place at 11%. and Rick L. Perry, not the former governor, different Rick Perry, getting 3% of the vote.
Yeah, and as we talked about before with the Attorney General race, same thing here. As long as Abbott stays above the 50% threshold, he'll advance directly to the general election in November.
Now, his Democratic opponent there will be Beto O'Rourke. The former congressman, former presidential candidate, was the only high-profile Democrat willing to take on the challenge. So far, numbers looking very good for Beto. You can see 92%, the overwhelming early vote from the Democrats coming in for Beto O'Rourke. Joy Diaz, Michael Cooper, second place at just 3%.
Yeah, O'Rourke talked to his supporters already this evening to get them ready for the horse race against Governor Abbott.
Looks like we'll have some of that sound for you just as soon as we're able to get it. But Aaron, this is a matchup that has seemed almost inevitable ever since, well, even before O'Rourke actually put his name in to say he was running.
Yeah, this was predicted for a long time, and then he put his name in, and it was kind of cemented. But not surprising on the Democratic side, Republican side, not surprising as well. But I wonder, was there a little bit of that regional play in effect as well on that side, with Huffines being kind of in the DFW area, Allen West being pretty well known in that area, and out here? Do you feel like there's some of that play with this race as well? Not as much as the Attorney General race, but still.
Sure, to some degree there is. We've seen, again, with the Smith County results, Allen West coming in second with 20% of the vote. Huffines much lower out here. Looking, I'm sure, at DFW, Huffines has been the state senator there, has a family history there, likely to be polling much better there as well.
Yeah.
But certainly not enough to counteract the money and the tradition and the name recognition and the history that Greg Abbott has in Texas.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because as this race started, I would argue Greg Abbott, when he was elected, pretty moderate Republican, and actually AP just called that race for Governor Greg Abbott. Okay. So he's advancing to the general. Yeah, we pretty much knew that was going to happen. But my question is, you know, I would argue that he was pretty moderate in 2015 when he was elected, and as this campaign has gone on, Huffines, West have pulled him a little bit more to the right. So the question is, in the general, does he stay to the right, or does he move back more into the moderate category to try and get voters from Beto?
That's going to be a good question. Texas, just such a red state historically, he might be counting on the fact that he wouldn't lose many votes to Beto O'Rourke. And now we know that the Associated Press has called that race on that side
as well. It's like they timed it, our conversation, you know, it's like they knew.
Thank you, Associated Press. But again, when you have 92% of the early vote, it's not a stretch to say that Beto O'Rourke's going to continue to get those big numbers. We've seen, you know, O'Rourke get lambasted nationally and here in Texas for saying during the presidential election, hell yeah, I'm going to take your guns.
Yeah.
That's a tough statement to come back from to potentially pull Republicans away from Greg Abbott.
Yeah, and the Republicans have used that in the primary as well. You remember Governor Abbott was out here a couple weeks ago, and that was one of the first things he said when he was out in Tyler. And he said it in, I believe, Wichita Falls, several of his campaign stops. That's one of the first sound bites he brings up, is like, you can't really come back from that. It's tough to really pull that back, even in a general.
Yeah. So let's continue to dig a little deeper into this race. Professor Owens, if you're still with us, talk a little bit about what you've seen, especially given that Governor Greg Abbott had that challenge from Don Huffines, from Allen West, but seemed to sail right through it.
Yeah, looks like we're having some challenges getting the guest at the moment.
Yes.
But it's an interesting race, for sure.
And now we get another 6 months until November. Or, excuse me, that's 8 months, I guess. It's hard to believe.
It all blends together.
It does. We're just going to get so many ads.
Yeah.
Because Beto O'Rourke has the ability to raise money. We've seen that from him as the Democratic challenger. Governor Abbott has a $50 million war chest and has even outraised O'Rourke in these last several months when they've both been running. We're going to get blitzed with commercials.
And it's almost like the precursor in the primary, right? We've had O'Rourke saying, hey, ERCOT, big issue with Governor Abbott. The COVID response could be an issue. The Republicans have gone after Governor Abbott for that. So there's all these things that we've seen in the primary that for sure are going to make it into the general election. I feel like O'Rourke's going to talk about ERCOT. Governor Abbott's going to say at the AK-47 comment, we're going to take your guns, take your AK-47s. So
yeah, and depending on what happens at the southern border, if immigration is still that big an issue, we're going to see that one show up too.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, now let's turn to some of our big local races. We have a few county commissioners' court races that turned into pretty tight competitions.
Yeah, take a look at this. In Gregg County, Shannon Brown faced an intriguing re-election campaign. Currently, take a look at this. Danny Craig with 52% of the vote. Shannon Brown has 42%. And then G. Floyd has 6%. Now, for context, Craig and Williams had previously held the seat, and Floyd ran against Brown in the 2018 general election.
But Brown pleaded guilty recently to election fraud, which was related to his narrow win in the 2018 primary. But Brown, again, going head-to-head with 3 other candidates. We see so far he is trailing. Now, Williams served as the interim commissioner in 2018, right before Brown took that spot. He had been on the Longview City Council for 10 years. This is the first position, though, he's had to campaign for.
It's been real good. I like being out and talking to the people and dealing with the people. Once you kind of get that bug of serving people, you like serving the people, and you want to make sure that the people voices are heard.
Now, because there are 4 candidates on the ballot, some voters out there in Gregg County expressed that it might not be one person able to get 50%, even though that's the case so far. So Williams told CBS19 he is prepared for a runoff in May if that occurs.
Meanwhile, Smith County Commissioners Court Precinct 1, Pam Frederick with 54%. She's the mayor of Bullard, and she's running against Fritz Hager, which as of right now, 46% for him. He's the former Tyler ISD board president. They're running to replace Neil Franklin, who will be the next Smith County judge. And if you remember back in 2020, Pam Frederick ran for that same position against Neil Franklin, went into runoff, and then she conceded the race. So it's definitely a comeback for her, at least right now.
Yeah, that's one of the 2 big Smith County Commissioners Court races we're watching. Precinct 2 is the other one. It's a 3-way race after Carrie Nix chose not to run again. Right now, we're seeing John Moore with 55% of the votes that have come in thus far, Mike Adams getting 34%, and Anwar Khalifa getting 11%. But again, John Moore, 55, he is above that threshold, which might not expect in a 3-man race. There's been a lot of advertising money spent on this one locally as well.
Yeah, and interesting, the Precinct 1 Smith County one as well, just because Pam ran for it in 2020, had some name recognition there, current mayor of Bullard. And so she has those credentials. It was interesting to watch in 2020 because if you remember, we brought them in, we interviewed all of them. Yes. Very strong all across the board. But it's interesting to see her taking the lead now because obviously both very strong names. You have a former Tyler ISD person, you have a former mayor, so interesting to see those numbers. Yeah, and certainly each of them have their regional bases. Yeah. Hager, Tyler, with everyone in Tyler ISD knowing him. Pam Frederick outside of the city, perhaps being able to corral a little bit more of those votes tonight. Yeah, and it's always fun to watch the local races like this to see because I feel like, nationally we know kind of what's happening. We see trends, we see polls. These can be wild cards sometimes. Yeah, and as David Stein mentioned when he spoke with Marangeli Lopez earlier, these votes have to be driven over to the Maine County Elections Administration's office. So it may take a little bit longer for some of those polling sites that are outside of Tyler city limits to get brought in. So again, if we're talking about Pam Frederick's home turf, it may be a little tougher, or take a little longer for those votes from Bullard to come in. Yeah. So we could still see some drastic swings in the numbers as the night goes on. Yeah, exactly. It's too soon to tell. This is the fun part of tonight, right? Like with the local races, it's too soon to tell. Get to have a little fun with it. Yeah, but again, it's exciting. We love having this opportunity. Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. Do we want to circle back to the governor for a little bit and talk about that one? Yeah, because this is going to be the big race. As we're now looking at a live shot from Corpus Christi. This is where Governor Abbott is going to be speaking tonight. You can see the giant Texas flag, and I believe there's a battleship sitting out in the harbor behind it. We know these 2 candidates have been focused more on each other than their primaries. Yeah. We saw, Don Huffines and Alan West and Chad Prather's 3 of the Republican challengers teamed up in a sense to try and take on Abbott to see if one of them could get into a runoff. Yeah. It doesn't appear to have worked, and Abbott probably knew he had a comfortable lead. He hasn't focused on them at all. All of his resources have been focused toward Beto O'Rourke. It was interesting though looking back because I feel like I've been saying the word interesting a lot, but it really is interesting. Yeah. Looking back and seeing how when Huffines would release a statement or say something, you would get a response from Governor Abbott. So I mean he knew what was happening and he saw it happen. So even though maybe he knew he was comfortable in the primary, he didn't take the chance. He did swing a little bit further to the right to match in some ways Huffines and then West as well. Yeah, especially last summer when the Texas legislature was still in session and when Governor Abbott would bring them back into session, he would add on bills that he wanted them to take up, which were in part things that especially Don Huffines had mentioned in his campaign that he thought were important issues. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do we want to bring up that results number real quick? We can see the big lead on the challenger, 69%. So AP's already called the race. But, I mean, just for context, David, I mean, you look, actually it's 11% match right now, Don Huffines and Alan West. And we were talking about this earlier. Similar thing with Congressman Gohmert here, maybe some regional play happening with both Huffines and West.
Yeah, and even though Huffines was a state senator and had that large role, he might not have had many people know of him, even still, outside of the Metroplex. Right. Allen West had been the chairman of the state Republican Party, but only for 1 year. He had previously been a congressman from Florida, so he didn't have much of a background in Texas other than the last, let's say, 18 months.
Yeah.
So still did not have the same kind of broad recognition and appeal that Governor Abbott has.
And then Rick L. Perry with 3% of the vote. Great name, though. I mean, you know, there's some name recognition there, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a good way to get some votes.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So now we just have to wonder and see what Beto O'Rourke will do from here. He knows the challenge he's up against. Mm-hmm. He knows he has a deficit to overcome. All the polling so far of a potential horse race shows a gap anywhere from 7 to 10% trailing Governor Greg Abbott. He's got to have to find a way to make that up.
Do you think that that's possible to be made up between now and November? Because I look back at the 2018 race with Ted Cruz, and obviously when you're running for Senate, very different than running for governor in the state. Mm-hmm. Do you, and especially after the comments made during the presidential election with taking guns, do you think he can make that up? I mean, there's obviously areas that are very blue in Texas, and then there are people undecided, there are people on the fence. Is that an area where he can make it up, or is it just at this point it's likely going to be Abbott?
There's still a large swath of independents who could be swayed, and some of that might be completely out of the two candidates' control. It might be dependent on what happens in Washington. If Joe Biden becomes a more popular president, if inflation goes down and the economy looks like it's great, then that would be something that Governor Abbott might not be able to attack O'Rourke about. He's tried already to attack O'Rourke as being similar to Biden, who's right now very unpopular.
Yeah.
If American defenses help Ukraine stave off Russia, maybe that makes President Biden more popular and helps Democrats all the way down as we get toward November.
But there's one thing that so many Texans across the board are frustrated about, and rightfully so, and it was last year's winter storm and with ERCOT. And we've already seen Beto go toe-to-toe with Governor Abbott about this. He's like, Governor Abbott failed us. The ERCOT grid failed. It's essentially Governor Abbott's fault. The protections he's put in place since then aren't enough. There's the argument that he took money from people during the ERCOT, the freeze. So that's in play as well. I mean, so we think about these these things that we remember from a year ago, like ERCOT. We think about those things. I mean, to your point, it could sway.
Yeah, but at the same time, the Texas legislature did put in changes meant to protect the electric grid. Governor Abbott championed those, and it doesn't look like we're going to have, well, hopefully we don't have another big freeze for the rest of this winter and spring, and probably won't until fall. So we don't know if Beto O'Rourke will really have the chance to hammer if the system could fail.
Yeah.
It didn't fail during the freezes that we had this winter, so that was a potential point that he may not have anymore.
Let's take a look at those Democratic numbers real quick as well, just to go back to those. We have Beto O'Rourke, again, AP called this race, 92%. Joy Diaz with 3%, Michael Cooper with 3%, and then Rich Wakeland with 1%.
But let's go back and talk a little bit about some of these local races, because of course we want to focus on the things that are important to East Texans. So we want to bring in our partners over at the Tyler Morning Telegraph. Santana Wood is the managing editor of the paper. Santana, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. Always interesting and fun on election night, and lots of results starting to come in. Going to be an interesting night.
So first, Santana, give us your thoughts on what we've seen with Texas Congressional District 1, Smith County Judge Nathaniel Moran off to a very big lead so far.
I think, not a big surprise there so far. Obviously, still a lot of numbers left to come in, but, having that potential new representation, I mean, it's going to be new representation in Congress no matter what, but that's really an important choice. And like I said, not surprised to see that Judge Moran is in the lead so far. Definitely. And, there's just a lot of key races to watch in this primary, especially locally. One of the overarching themes is kind of new faces in office, right? Not very many incumbents on the ballots, going to have a new Democratic Party chair, County Commissioners, Precincts 1 and 2, obviously interested to see how that race will end up shaping up tonight. Another one I know a lot of residents in Smith County are watching is County Constable Precinct 2, with the conviction of former Constable Joshua Black back in September. That precinct is really looking to restore some integrity, and I'm really interested to see how that one's going to turn out as well.
Santana, was there anything that really surprised you tonight? I mean, I know we talked about the District 1 race, some of the local races, but is there anything you're watching and you're like, oh, that's unexpected, a little bit different?
Not necessarily. Kind of like you mentioned earlier, the Precinct 1 County Commissioner race in Smith County, kind of close right now, although I believe Pam Frederick is still in the lead at this point. But like y'all mentioned, they each have their respective supportive audiences, so that wasn't really much of a surprise, although I'm really interested to see how that will continue to go as the night goes on. Will they stay close, or will Pam continue to edge out front?
Yeah, as we see up on the screen right now, Pam Frederick still with 54% of the early vote, Fritz Hager with 46%. That could be one that takes a while to settle. So also we have the Commissioner's Court race for Precinct 2, as we had 3 candidates who are running there to fill a vacant seat. We have John Moore seems to be out to a fairly substantial lead so far. Again, the latest numbers show 55% for John Moore. Mike Adams, a retired medic, at 34%. Anwar Khalifa, a home builder, part of the religious community here in Smith County, just 11%. Again, we have a couple of big changes, Santana. What do you foresee any changes to the way the Commissioner's Court could act now that we have 2 new members coming in?
I think so, and I think that, like I said, it's kind of a theme of new faces across the county, from local races even to in Congress, and I think that you can always benefit from having that new perspective in those seats. And when we look at Precinct 2, for example, John Moore in the lead. He's lived in Precinct 2 all his life. Really, again, not a huge shock to me that he is in the lead so far tonight, but another one we will see how it shapes up.
Santana, I want to ask you as well, David and I were talking about this earlier. We saw Louis Gohmert run in this Attorney General race. It looks like numbers as of right now aren't necessarily favoring him in a runoff. May change as the night goes on, but as of right now, not. What do you see as a potential future for him? I mean, if he doesn't get this, obviously he's now leaving Congress.
Yeah, I think that, when we look back to when Louis announced that he would leave Congress and run for Texas Attorney General, we were a little shocked. And we are going to talk to him soon to see what his next steps will be. I'm curious to know what he wants to see in the Attorney General race, if not him, and also what he hopes to see from his former congressional seat for the person who will be representing East Texas in his place. And, it is very interesting. I think you guys mentioned earlier that Louis got, a very high percentage of early votes and absentee ballots in Smith County for Attorney General. Although, that may not be how it turns out statewide, I think he does have quite a few supporters here in East Texas.
All right, Santana Wood from the Tyler Morning Telegraph, thank you. And of course, you'll be able to get lots of information about these races when the paper comes out tomorrow morning. Santana, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we keep getting new numbers in. Again, Louis Gohmert in Smith County still showing more than 60% of the votes here, but this one, only at 3% of the precincts statewide reporting so far for this race for Attorney General. So we currently have Ava Guzman and George P. Bush neck and neck in that second spot, that all-important second spot. there will still be lots of twists and turns in this race for Attorney General.
For sure. I mean, but when I look at the names, when you do break it down, Ken Paxton been in the position for a while. Eva Guzman, former Texas Supreme Court Justice, so some name recognition there. George P. Bush, Land Commissioner, has the Bush name. And then with Gohmert, with Congressman Gohmert, obviously, like, as the results are showing, very well known out here, but just not necessarily that statewide name recognition, it looks like, given either in the state or what he's done in Congress. Obviously, we know him, but other people don't.
No, and most of these candidates, with the possible exception of Guzman, really tried to play up their connections to Donald Trump. Ken Paxton got the official endorsement, but Trump had endorsed Louis Gohmert earlier on as a member of Congress. They've spoken on the same stage. In all of his commercials, Gohmert mentioned that Trump said he was incredibly tough, especially when it comes to border issues. George P. Bush had touted his connections to the former president. They've spoken at events before. Former President Trump had called him the only Bush he liked. So that had been a big play of who could attract the Trump, quote-unquote, voter.
Yeah.
And not necessarily sure if any of them really did.
It's just tough to get you have what President Trump calls the complete and total endorsement. So Paxton obviously got that one. It's tough to get the partial endorsement, right? Where it's like, I sort of like you, you know, like you're nice, like I like you. Yeah. So I think there was some of that. And even to your point, maybe it was just everybody was in some way endorsed by President Trump, so it kind of waters it down.
And that official endorsement came before Congressman Gohmert got in the race.
Yeah.
And he mentioned in an interview at one point, he thought there may have been some behind-the-scenes dealings to make it happen that quickly. Before Gohmert got in, he thought he might have been the one, had President Trump known at the time, to get that endorsement. And that could, again, be an issue that comes up in the runoff, whichever candidate it is.
The ads were fascinating to me in this campaign because I feel like I say this every election cycle, but I was fascinated by the attack ads by fellow Republicans, where it was I believe it was Ken Paxton with Eva Guzman, you know, and of course you see the text and typical political ad, right? Like very fiery, very, you know, biting. But all you see on the screen is indoctrinate kids. And I mean, so they were going for the jugular to fellow Republicans, which I think was particularly interesting.
And said something as well that Ken Paxton came out with his very first campaign ads in East Texas, specifically to target Louis Gohmert.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've seen all four of them at various stages, and there was a debate between the three challengers. Paxton didn't attend it, and they all took turns attacking each other, even though all their platforms are very similar. All of their promises as candidates are very similar, but they had to find those little ways to try to separate themselves to get those votes.
Yeah, particularly in a race like this where you have a pretty strong, even though he's had obviously some challenges, to put it lightly, during his campaign, very well known across the state, lots of name recognition. The other thing that was interesting to me about this, at least the numbers so far, I'm assuming they're still the same if we can pull about 21% for Eva Guzman, 21% for George P. Bush, running neck and neck, as you can see right now. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and the most recent statewide poll numbers we'd seen showed Bush at somewhere around 25%.
Right.
Guzman and Gohmert somewhere in that 15-16% range. Of course, there's the margin of error. Of course, you never know just how accurate a poll's going to be. And again, this is still so early, we're not entirely sure which precincts, which counties have reported. We know there have been issues in Harris County. They've been struggling to count ballots tonight and have gotten some help from the Secretary of State's office to make sure all their ballots actually get counted.
Yeah.
So if there are issues with people from Houston being able to get their votes counted so far, that could have a huge swing on who ends up becoming the second.
I mean, Harris County, one of the largest counties in the state, so it's for sure interesting. We have a live pick of Governor Abbott's campaign as well. You can see, I believe you said there was a battleship behind that, if I'm not mistaken, with the Texas flag.
Right, he's right there on the water in Corpus Christi. Got the very large Texas flag. Again, we're still waiting for Governor Abbott to speak to his supporters. We know that the Associated Press has called the race for him, so it might not be long before he does get there and speak, and I'm sure he'll have a very celebratory tone. Probably not surprised.
Yeah.
I'm sure he knew that this was coming, but time to rally the troops, rally the supporters for a big, big, expensive fight come November.
But there were points in the campaign where I feel like there were moments where he maybe had a little bit of sweat, where it wasn't necessarily like, this is in the bag for me. It may be a runoff. I mean, there were some parts earlier in I believe, was it last year? Late last year, where, I mean, he was obviously ahead for a long period of time and has been since the beginning, but I don't feel like he would track right like he did if he wasn't concerned on some level about those voters.
Yeah, there were certainly a lot of people who didn't think he was tough enough when it came to securing the border and stopping illegal immigration. There were a lot of people who were frustrated with him, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when he shut down businesses and did not specifically ban masks and did not ban vaccine mandates initially. There were a lot of people who said he's not doing enough to protect our liberty. And that's when we started to see, especially Huffines being one of the first challengers to get into the race, that's what he said drew him. He wanted to make sure that there were more troops from Texas at the border because he didn't think that the presidency was doing enough to protect Texas, to stop immigration. And one of his campaign points was that he wanted to ban vaccine mandates. And eventually, Governor Abbott did go that direction as well.
Yeah, it's almost like we talked about it a second ago. It's almost like, in a way, a preview of what's to come with Beto O'Rourke and Governor Abbott. You know, we've got those tentpole issues that they've essentially talked about from the beginning that are just going to roll right into the main campaign.
Yeah, but of course, you never know what the next 8 months are going to hold. And we're about to sign off for a little bit, but we are far from done covering election night in Texas. But if you don't want to wait until 10 o'clock for the new numbers, just text us.
Yeah, if you send the word results to our CBS19 helpline right there on your screen, it's 903-600-2600. We'll send the most up-to-date information right to your smartphone. No doubt about it, it's a huge night for East Texas and the state as a whole. There aren't that many districts where either a Republican or a Democrat could win. So tonight's results will decide most of the ultimate winners.
That's right. And as the future of East Texas and our state are shaped, we will be here to help you make sense of it. Be sure to join us on CBS 19 News at 10 right after the State of the Union address. We'll show you how the results are changing and bring you the reactions from the candidates.
And of course, don't forget you can check our website as well, CBS19.tv, and our mobile app. Until then, we'll see you tonight at 10.